Hello everyone, welcome back to your favorite class, I'm sure, INST377. Alright, it feels like I haven't talked to you all in a while. Obviously, there was the midterm last week, so it's been quite a while. So anyway, glad to be talking with you, all of you again, and really excited. We've started reviewing some of the project submissions, and I'm starting to look through, and they're really exciting stuff. So I'm really excited. Now today, what we're going to start talking about is actually starting the usage of APIs, which is really important for the project as well, and is actually the foundation of the modern web infrastructure. APIs are basically how the web communicates with each other, right? So you go to a website, 99.9999% of the time, there's an API call being made to something to basically go and get data from somewhere, right? So APIs have become standard in this industry, and I'm really excited to start introducing you to these, right? Because I'll tell you, like for me, I didn't learn them until, I actually got to start like building them at work and stuff, and a little bit here and there, but like really I didn't get really introduction until much later. So I'm really excited for us to be actually getting to start using these and start learning how to leverage them, because they are so fundamental to how we build software nowadays that it's just crucial to understand this. So what we're going to be talking about today is just different APIs, standards, usage, and also doing a lot of JavaScript, right? And how we integrate APIs with that, and kind of building some really interesting dynamic code with that. So with that, let's go ahead and get right in and let's get started. All right. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the APIs, standards, usage, basically learning APIs, JSON, and we're also going to be learning something called the fetch method in JavaScript, which is really exciting, right? So this is actually how we're going to be leveraging APIs in our code going forward, so that we can actually use this for dynamic websites actually. All right, so let's hop right in. All right, so first of all of you might be talking and like thinking, hey, first of all, what even is an API? What does that mean? So it's a really great question. So API stands for Application Programming Interface, right? And we might have roughly talked about this before, but think about them as the communication medium of the web, right? And it's kind of in the name itself, right? Application Programming Interface, right? So it's a way, an interface for communication. So think about it as an interface to communicate with your application program, right? It's kind of interesting when you think about it like that, right? And APIs are effectively how we communicate from our browsers, etc., to the backends, right? And so if you remember, we use HTTP requests to make an invocation to an API, right? So if you remember last time, right, we made invocations via Postman and via like our browser to APIs, right? So for example, there was an API to get X amount of data, right? So we made API calls, right? And so you can think of it like this, right? So here as an end user, you go to some sort of browser or some sort of website, and in that it'll make API calls, and these API calls will be the layer that actually goes and gets your data from the database, etc., right? So for example, let's say you go to Amazon, right? You log onto Amazon, and you start seeing all these products, right? The way it gets those products is by making an API call that says slash list products, right? So there's an API that's made and gets you all that data, right? Because it can't come out of thin air. And as we discussed last time, the client-side code can't directly communicate with the database. The server-side code does. So the API allows the client side to actually get this data and render it on the screen or display it on the screen, right? So APIs are really, really useful. And basically, it's the primary way that we actually communicate with our backends. So for example, in the app that I work on today, right, we actually built out this API infrastructure using, we have REST APIs, etc. And our UI is hosted on something called CloudFront, which is basically like a S3 bucket or like a static hosting thing. And all it does is it goes and makes an API call to our backend, right? We have a Spring Boot backend and also a Node backend. And it just goes and makes an API call and gets the data, right? So it's like, oh, okay, here's the things you can display for this user, right? So your client doesn't have to figure all that out because it would be too much processing for your client. But yeah. All right. So let's think of this another way, right? So an API, right, we know has an end user with a browser, makes a request, and it goes to the backend system and then gets a response. Now, let's think of this in a different, like a non-technical way, right? So let's say you go to a restaurant, right? You're a customer, right? and you go and you make an order, right? Now, you aren't directly making the order, and assume it's a fancy Michelin star, you really dressed up, so you don't directly make the order, right? You give it to a waiter, right? And then your waiter takes that order and takes it to the chef, and the chef basically prepares it however he prepares it. You don't know about that. Prepares it. Then the waiter takes the order from the kitchen and then delivers it to you, right? So that intermediate layer there, the waiter, is the equivalent of an API. Now, traditionally, we don't tip APIs, but, I guess you could if you want. But effectively, as you can tell, right, as a customer, right, it's completely abstracted to me how I'm getting my food, right? It's just being brought to me. And it's the same thing with API. An API abstracts how the data that's being responded with is being generated. It's just you expect a response, right? And for example, right, when I make an order, I look on a menu and I see, oh, okay, I'm ordering this dish, and this dish has X components. So I expect the dish to have X components. Just like that, in a request that we make, we expect a certain response, right? And so just like that, when you deliver the order, you expect a certain response. So it's kind of interesting, right? So APIs and this kind of scenario plays a very interesting role, right? Okay. All right. Oh my gosh, what's going on? Sorry. Okay. So when we talk about APIs, there's actually multiple types of APIs. There are two primary API types that we have. So one's called REST and one is called SOAP. And you might ask, like, what does that even mean? What, like, rest? Like, am I going to sleep? SOAP? Like, what am I cleaning? Neither of those. So SOAP and REST are actually ways for data exchange to occur, right? And for this class, we're only going to cover REST. Why is that? Well, REST is the modern API communication style and is the de facto standard for many years now for how we communicate via APIs, right? So REST standards, and we'll go a little bit more into what that means. So what's the difference, SOAP versus REST? So think of REST APIs like a postcard versus SOAP APIs like an envelope with a letter inside it, right? So both of these obviously work, but on the web, we need to be fast and we need simplicity, right? Without the overhead of the wrapper, right? You can still put a stamp directly on the postcard, or you can put it on the envelope, but then you have to open the envelope, like tear it open, remove the thing, and then read it, right? Now, it's interesting, right? And you might be like, I see some benefits to that. And yes, there might be. But the problem is on the web, there isn't really, because this extra wrapping adds like a big layer and basically makes it so that it's actually much more time consuming to actually take out the data. Now, you might think, oh, how much faster? How much slower can it be? Like a few milliseconds, etc. But that starts to add up. Think about millions and millions of requests being made. That small time that it's adding, right? It can be 50, 100 milliseconds, adds up, right? If you think about it, the average API response should be anywhere from 100 to maybe max 200-300 milliseconds, maybe half a second, right? 500 milliseconds. So when we are adding 100 milliseconds, that's almost adding 20% to the response time, which is a lot, right? So being able to, move the data in a faster and cheaper and probably lighter way is very crucial in the web. And that's where REST shines. So RESTful APIs are very lean and they allow you to send all the data, but it's still faster and cheaper. Now, what does REST actually stand for? Obviously, it doesn't mean to nap, but it stands for representational state transfer, right? Think of REST APIs like a software architecture that imposes a condition on how an API should work, right? So remember, again, we don't actually care what's happening in the API, right? In the background, right, you could be running a Bitcoin mining factory to get me a response. But at the end of the day, I expect that my response says X, Y, and Z, right? So all the REST API does is say, okay, let me go to the server, request the data, and return it in an expected format. So now for an API to be considered RESTful, it has to have a few properties. First, it has to be a uniform interface, right? So what that means is all API requests for the same resource should look the same no matter where the request comes from, right? So for example, let's say, you send your API request from Canada, I send mine from US, right? regardless of where it is, right? The resource, right, looks the same, right? I still make the same API call, right? So whether I'm in Canada, I still call it /API/get users, or I don't suddenly change this to get users Canada, right? That's what I mean, right? And the data is basically the same. So no matter where the request comes from, the API stays the same, right? Now, what's really important is client and server apps as part of REST APIs must be independent of each other. Now, you might ask, okay, what does that even mean, right? Great question. So let's think about it like this. So as a client, right, all I care about is that I get the data, right? Like I said, right, if you're running a Bitcoin mining factory in the server, I don't care, right? At the end of the day, all I expect is that my REST API has this kind of data, right? All I care about is that my REST API has name, colon, okay? At the end of the day, this is all I care, right? You could be running a Bitcoin mining factory to get that data. You could be looking it up in the database. You could be going to the moon and back for all I care. But at the end of the day, this client just cares that it gets a response. It doesn't care about what the server does, right? And this is actually a very common practice in the industry. So for example, I'll tell you an example, right? So we recently started moving our application code away from Java to JavaScript, right? Very big change. But what we did is we made it so that our client and our server actually, or our client kept receiving the same data regardless of where the data source was. And that was really important because otherwise these transitions become very, very costly and very, very expensive, right? And the benefit of something like this is, let's say your client is a SaaS or is an enterprise, right? And they're consuming your data from an API, right? You might need to undergo a major rehaul of your backend. But at the end of the day, as long as you're returning the data the same way, they don't actually care if you had to do a 10-month rehaul, as long as data kept showing up the same way. So that's why decoupling the client and server is really important. Now, in general, APIs, REST APIs, are stateless. They do not store any data. And you might ask, well, you told me I could get specific data, right? I get how many orders I have, etc. So how do they store that information? So the APIs themselves don't, but there are different things like JOT tokens and different authentication methods that we can leverage to say, oh, okay, here's how you get around this, and here's how you actually pass user-specific data across. And then data is cacheable. So data can actually be cached if necessary. And now what's really interesting is that REST APIs have to be a layered system, right? Which basically means the API shouldn't care what is being done in the layers below. It should be invisible from an experience standpoint, right? So all of these stand for REST APIs. Now I'll give one asterisk here. Cacheable is only for GET calls, right? So only for retrieves. Post data can't be cached, so I'll just call that out. But other than that, all of this applies to all REST APIs, so good to know. All right. Now, in this class, what really is our end goal, right? So in this class, we have a few main goals, right? First, we are looking to learn how to actually leverage REST APIs, right? So learning the structure of data being sent via REST APIs, learning the structure of data being received via REST APIs, and learning how to invoke REST APIs in your code, right? All of these will be leveraged for the project, right? And then also we're learning to look how to create APIs, also something that we'll do in the project. We'll be creating our own server in this class, which is really, really exciting. Now that is of course in a later lecture, but it's a lot of fun doing it. So yeah. Okay, so before we move forward, I do want to give a quick refresher of data types, right? So in JavaScript, there are 8 data types, 2 of these which indicate none, right? String, number, big int, boolean, undefined, null, symbol, and object. Undefined and null indicate null. And then there is a object. An object is a JavaScript object notation, JSON, right? And it's an object, an array, a date, and this is actually really important for REST APIs because REST APIs typically communicate via JSON. So it's super important, especially for this chapter, right? And so we'll be focusing a lot on objects. So what is JSON really? So JSON is how REST APIs send data and how they respond, right? So JSON is just a data storage type, but it's a much more formal structure than an object. It looks a lot like an object in code, but has very strict requirements around structure. So for example, it can't have comments, it can't have undefined values, it can't have trailing commas. Now, JSON is a very common syntax to store and transfer data across web applications. It is the communication language, right? And what's interesting is there's multiple other options, right? So there's one called XML, right? There's also different things like protobufs and all these kind of interesting things you can use, but JSON has become the industry standard over the years. Now, the reason is because the formal structure of JSON makes it better to transmit data than an object, because it has a known good state, which makes it much easier and less error prone to parse. And data is generally stored and transferred as text, right? Which means it's really lightweight and it's programming language independent, right? So this JSON is actually supported across multiple languages. So Java has support for it, Python, XML, Go, or sorry, Python, Go, C++. Everybody has a JSON library that they can trust. And what's great is, let's say you don't want to use the external library. Since it's a string, and since it has a known good state, what you can do is you can actually manually parse it, right? And I'll tell you an example that I had to do this for, actually, not that long ago. But basically, in our architecture, we have this lambda, which is just like a serverless function, which basically executes before every single API call. And what this lambda does is basically goes and authenticates that, hey, like, you're actually allowed to use this API, right? So what I had to do is, in that lambda, since it's so fast, like this needs to return in 10 to 20 milliseconds at most, right? I had to not use another package because that would add a lot of weight to the lambda. I had to manually parse out the JSON, right? Now, I'll tell you, I didn't need to end up doing that, but that is how I started. And I was able to build my own parser really quickly because it's really simple, right? JSON has a very well-defined known state and bad state, and you can parse based on that and be able to actually process the data. So it makes it really easy to work with. That is why JSON has won, because it's so easy to work with no matter what, right? Even if you don't have a library that supports it, you can build your own. So now, I talked a little bit about this, but are there alternatives to JSON? Well, the answer is yes. So first is, there's one called Protobuf, which is a communication language actually established by Google, which is really great, but it's very strict, right? For example, if you define something in Protobuf, you can't really change it. It's very strict in a sense, but it's really, really fast. Then there's YAML. YAML is really flexible. It allows for more types, but it's not really suitable when sending it over the wire. It's not a super flexible data type text-wise, and it's not as great. Then there's XML. XML is more verbose and can be complex to read, but it is an option. But across all of this, JSON really has been accepted as the go-to, as it is a good middle ground and superbly flexible, but also very strict in terms of its overall structure, right? So that's why it's really good. So let's take a look at this, right? So here's a JSON breakdown. So JSON in general is always a key value pair. 1 second. Okay. So the key is always a string in quotes. So if you look here, right? Oh, actually, maybe I zoomed past it a little too fast. So if you look at this, right? First of all, it's a key value pair. So what's a key value pair? So if you look at this is a key and this is the value, right? So name is the key, value is on Moldash. Name is phone, and the value here is the object, right? The object. And then within that object, there's a key and a value. Okay, so that's what a key value pair is. Okay, then the key is always a string in quotes. So if you take a look at this, right, the key is always a string, right? And that's really important, right? But the value can be a variety of objects. So if you take a look at this, the value for enrollment year is a number. The value of is student is a Boolean, right? Or it can be quotes, right? Or it can be string, right? So the value can be a variety of objects. So it can be a number, it can be a string, it can be a Boolean, it can be another object, right? So for example, if you take a look here, this indicates that it's another object, right? So both of these are options. Now, what's really important is the value does not need to be in quotes unless it is a string, right? If it's not a string, it doesn't need to be in quotes. It can be like a number, 2016, just like that, right? And now, really important, each key value pair here has a comma in between, right? So if you see, there's a comma in between each of the key value pairs, right? And each key value pair, even within an object, has a comma. So you can see this is an object, and even then this has a key value pair and it has a comma in between them, right? So that's really important, right? So JSON is very simple, right? So as you can see, really it's just curly braces. It's just like a JavaScript object. The only difference is at the end, right? There's no comma here, right? If you put a comma here, it's technically invalid. So that's the one thing. Okay. So now a JSON object is really just like a dictionary or a map or a hash table, right? So all you do is you define an object, right? And so some of you might have worked with Python or Java. So dictionaries or maps in Python or Java might sound very similar. So you define an object, and object contents themselves are not constant, but the object type is, right? So that's why we're able to do const object, right? Now, it cannot have two of the same keys. So that's one really important rule in JSON, right? So you can't have two names. But what you can do is you can access the object by the name. So what you can do is you can do console.log object.name. And we did this once last class as well, right? So object.name. And then you would get Bill, right? And you can also manipulate it by setting values via the key. So you can do object.name equals Dana, right? Now, if you remember, when we use document.getElementById, this is actually a function stored on an object key, right? Document is nothing but an object in JavaScript, which is really cool, right? Now, let's look at something. So when we work with JSON, there's a few options. We can do JSON.stringify, which takes a piece of JavaScript written in a valid style to a JSON string, and then this converts everything into JSON and replaces undefined objects with null, right? So let's take a look. So we have let person equals blah, let p underscore JSON equals JSON.stringify, and so when we console.log that, we'll get name, bill, number 24, right? But then on the vice versa, we can also do a parse, right? So we can basically take some JSON into a JavaScript object, right? And that could be like a string, right? So you take the pJSON string and parse that. And then what you can do is you can say, hey, stored name is equal to data.name, right? Because when you're in the string here, you can't do data.name. You have to just print out the string, okay? Now, one really important thing that we're going to be covering just in a bit is how do we access data in JSON? So there's actually two ways to access JSON data. First is via square brackets. So we can access JSON objects via square brackets. But if we access JSON data this way, we must use double quotes to indicate the variable name. So let's take a look at this, right? So const data equals json.parse pjson, console.log stored name, comma, data, quotes, name. But also you can access via a dot, and we can access JSON objects via the dot. And when we do this, the variable name does not need quotes when you access it this way. So let's take a look at this, right? So here you have a json.parse pjson, then stored name is data.name, right? Now, if you look at these, they look exactly the same. The only difference is this has square brackets, this has a dot, right? So you might ask, hey, when do I actually use one versus the another? Well, realistically, there's actually no reason to prefer one over the other. It's purely preference which one is better. Now, there are some situations where using one over the other might actually be easier. So for example, if you're using a function to get the key to access, right? Then you have to use square brackets, right? The dot approach won't work, right? So let's take a look at this, right? So let's say we had, let's create a JSON object here. So let's say we had a JSON object and it had name and colon bill. Okay. Okay, perfect. So we have this data, right? So now let's say we want to take this and we looked here and we saw, okay, I'm going to do data.getName to retrieve. So what this is saying is, let's pretend that there's a function called getName to retrieve, and it actually does something, right? So you do return name dot to lowercase. So what's that actually doing? It's saying, let me do this actually. It's doing const data. Okay, hold on. I need to erase this. This is not going well for me. 1 second. Const data equals name colon bill. Okay. So if we take a look at this, right? So return name dot to lowercase gets you name, right? So what we're saying is data dot name, right? So data dot name would return bill, right? But the problem is if you do this, you will not be able to get the data because it'll think it's a function of the data variable, which is not. So what you have to do is you say, hey, get me data at square bracket name, right? So now it'll do data and return bill, right? And that might sound a little confusing right now, but basically it's basically a function of how do we want to access this data, right? Do we want to access it via a function, which actually gives us the key? And if so, then we need to use square brackets. Or if we don't, we can just use normal, right? So in general, I do recommend using the square brackets, right? It's the more flexible option. But whatever really makes you happy, but just know that if you're trying to do something like this, which you will have to, hint, hint, somewhere in the assignment too, then I recommend using the square brackets, right? So it'll make your life a lot easier. All right. So now with this, let's go ahead and let's try an example and hop onto VS Code. All right, welcome back to your favorite program, VS Code. All right, let's get started. So we're going to go ahead and just start experimenting how we can actually use JSON and start accessing the data from JSON objects so that we can leverage it on our website, right? So what I'm going to set as the context here is we're going to say, hey, like, we're going to have this JSON, let's pretend it came from API, but it doesn't really matter. And how do we actually use it and show things on a website via it, right? So let's go ahead, and what we'll do is we'll create a new file. We'll call it okay, this always happens here. 1 second. INST377-week8-JSON access lecture.html. So great. This should be pretty easy, right? So we're going to create a very simple HTML. So we'll just create a HTML here. And let's say we add a head here, and we'll add a title. And we'll call JSON example. Okay. And then we also need to create a JavaScript, right? So we'll add a script. And for this, we'll actually create a JavaScript, like external JavaScript, right? So what we'll do here is we'll create a new file, and here's a little hint. You can do JavaScript / to create a folder called JavaScript, and then we'll name it exactly the same. So INST377-week8-JSON access lecture.js. Okay, cool. And I spelled lecture wrong, so I'll fix that right now. Okay, perfect. And perfect. So now all we're going to do is we're going to do script defer source equals JavaScript / INS3 blah blah blah. Perfect. Great. And here what we'll do is we'll create a very simple body. The body will just say h1. We'll say JSON example. And we'll put open the console tab to see what's going on, right? Cool, right? Very simple. Okay, amazing. So now what we can do is we can go here and we can go to here and go to our JavaScript. And actually first let's open up the browser, go live. All right, great. Okay, and we'll click inspect. Okay. Weird, this opened up on the wrong browser, so sorry. I've been testing a new browser called Comet. Pretty interesting, but okay. Anyway, all right, so let's open up inspect here. network, or no, sorry, console. All right, and let's clear this out. Cool. All right, so let's get started. So let's first, what we're going to do is we're going to create a nice little function called JSON manipulation, right? So we're going to call it, so we'll call a function called JSON manipulation. Okay, and of course we need that function to execute, so window.onload equals JSON manipulation, right? So we're going to do JSON manipulation. Perfect. So that'll just start the function every time so that we know the data loads. Okay. So what we'll do from here is we're going to start by creating a JSON, right? So let's just pretend that, oh, okay, we had a JSON, or like, you know, an API call was made. So let's just write, let's pretend an API call was made and we got some JSON, right? So what we'll do is we'll do const person equal to name colon dash comma email colon a-2 at umd.edu. Yep. And then graduation year 2020, and then we'll add other details. So that's another object. And we'll do state colon md, and then likes code colon true. Okay, now first thing you'll notice here is if we look at this, right, you'll notice that if you go back to the lecture, right, you'll notice that in the lecture I called it out that, hey, you know, like they should always have string or double quotes, right? Now why, when I click save, it gets rid of double quotes and it just keeps it like this? It's a great question. Well, remember, in JavaScript right now, this is an object. This is not technically the JSON, right? So what we have to do is actually JSONify it, right? Which we will do. We'll do a JSON.parsed, and you'll see it'll look different, right? So when it's actually sent over the network, it'll have double quotes and everything. But JavaScript itself is actually not that picky, so it removes that. But when we send it over the network, we still need double quotes, right? Like if we put this in Insomnia, it would not work, to be clear. Okay, so great, we have this, right? So now let's do something. Let's what if we display the object? So let's stringify the object. Print. And so all we have to do is do const stringified JSON equal to JSON.stringify and do person. Okay. And all we have to do here is do console.log and do, let's do non-stringified. And notice here I'm using the backtick, right? The same as the tilde key. It's the tilde key. Non-stringified, right? I'm using backticks so then I can put variables directly. So we're going to do person, and I should use the $. Okay, and then stringified, right? So we'll just copy that, and then we'll do stringified and do stringified JSON. I noticed I still spelled stringified wrong. Okay, perfect. Great. This is starting to look pretty solid, right? Amazing. Okay, let's go take a look at this. So now let's go back here and let's click X and just refresh the page. Okay, so now if you look at it, it's really interesting. So you see non-stringified gets you object, right? You're like, well, that doesn't mean much, right? Because it's not able to actually parse the object, right? It's just an object, so it's not able to print it. But now look at the stringified answer. So as I mentioned, right, it's starting to add the double quotes automatically, right? So when it actually takes the data, it adds the quotes, it does everything, right? So it's really interesting, right? So for example, if I added a undefined, right? Let's just say this was undefined, right? What will happen is this should become null, if I'm not wrong. if I, oh yeah, so as you can see, it just gets completely excluded. It's non-existent because undefined means nothing to the code, right? It's like, oh, it doesn't exist effectively. So it just omits it. So pretty interesting stuff, right? So now let's take this a step further. So now how do we actually access the elements in this object? So first, let's first take access elements in object. So first what we're going to do is just showcase how we can take a string and reparse this. So we can do a const reparsed equal to JSON.parse stringified JSON. Easy, right? And all we do here is do a console.log, and all we should do is reparsed, and do $sign reparsed. Okay. And if I can spell, that would be crucial to my success here. And if we go back and look at it, right, and we see reparse, it is now back to object. Great, cool. Now that's pretty simple, right? Looks pretty easy, like nothing crazy going on there. So now let's take this a step further. So now we have this. Now let's say we want to access a element in object. So actually, let me move this comment down, right? So actually, I'll add a comment here called convert back to object. Okay. So what we can do is now we take console.log, right? And what we'll do is we'll take backticks and we'll do stored name colon, and all we do is you do $sign, right? Reparsed dot name. Perfect, right? So let's take a look at what happens. So now it says stored name unmul dash. Cool, right? That's pretty nice, right? And now let's say you want to access this other details dot state, right? How would you do that? Well, what you do is you do reparse dot other details dot state. Okay. And if you take a look at that. So now you see that, right? So that's how nested objects work, right? So let's go back to this. Okay. And now let's say we can access it the other way, right? Via the array, which might be easier. So we can do console.log, and we can do stored name, and then I'll just put square brackets to indicate array, and we'll do $sign reparsed at name. Okay, now first you'll ask me, okay, what if I just put name? Okay, let's see what happens. So there's name, right? So let's go and see what happens. So you'll see, it says undefined, right? That means it doesn't exist, right? Even though that's not true. So whenever you use square brackets, you need to use quotes. Single quotes, double quotes, doesn't matter, right? But if you look here, right? There you go. Stored name array and mul dash, right? So now we're able to access the same object two different ways. So either via the dot name or via square brackets name, right? Now why is that, right? Why do we need single quotes, right? So if you don't use the quotes, right, then it will assume you are calling a function, not the actual value, right? So that's really important, right? So that's why we use this, okay? Now, you might ask, okay, great. Now, in the lecture, I talked a lot about, okay, you can access it either way, but if you're using a function, then you need to use square brackets, right? So let's take a look at what we might want to do. So let's say we have a list of elements here, right? And what we want to do is say, hey, you know, I want you to choose a random element to display every single time, right? So how might we do that? Well, first we would have to create some sort of like function that would choose a random element, and then we'd have to display it. So let's try and build something that does that, right? So what we'll do is we'll create a function called return random key element. Okay. And in here we'll have const field to select. And in here, we will have the key fields. So name, email, let's see, graduation year, and other details. Okay, perfect. So now we're going to have to say, hey, like, I want you to choose a random element from here, right? So what we're going to do is do const random selection equals field to select at, meaning square brackets, math.floor math.random times, oh, I forgot circly, or I forgot the parentheses, times field to select dot length, right? And you might remember this is very similar to probably what you did on the assignment, right? So now all we do is return that random selection. Okay, cool, easy enough. So now how do we display that? So let's try, right? So now we're saying, hey, choose name, email, blah, 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 right? So first let's see what it's returning, right? So let's do console.log output from return random key element colon and do $sign return random key element. Okay. So if we look here, there you go. Output from return random key element name. Now let's say we refresh. Graduation year, refresh, email, other details, completely random, right? Great. So it's returning the text, which is really important, right? So now what we have to do is we have to say, okay, great, we have the text. So now what we can do is we can say, okay, so now console.log do random element, right? Colon, $sign. And let's say we did reparsed dot return random key element. Okay, let's see what happens. So if you look here, it goes completely insane. It's like reparse is not, oh, reparsed, sorry. That's interesting. Reparsed, sorry. Right. So if you look here, it says return random key element is not a function, right? Because what it's trying to do is it's saying, hey, this reparsed variable does not contain return random key element, right? It's trying to say, oh, this is a, like if any of you are familiar with like modular coding, this would be like a class or something, and it's saying this is a method available for this class, right? So for example, like reparse dot there might be length, right? I think that's the option here, right? Let's see. Reparse dot length. Nope. Okay. But either way, it's basically a function that it's trying to do. So what you have to do is use square brackets. And then what you can do is do return a random key element and make that call. Okay. And now if you see here, it'll say, look at that. Random element unmol dash. Random element 2020. Random element A-2, right? And so now it's just cycling between elements and choosing random ones, which is great. Exactly what we wanted, right? And we could probably do a little better here. Let's see if we can do other details. Dot likes to code, maybe? Or likes code, sorry. Likes code. Let's see if this will work. And I should know. There's a lot of random combinations, apparently. Oh, no, it doesn't work. Okay, cool. All right, ignore exactly what I just said and don't do this, but I think you get the point, right? So if you need to get the key from some other function, then you must use square brackets. Otherwise, it will not work, right? It'll be very doohickey and it won't work well. But if you just need to get a single value like .name, then you can do the function, right? So pretty straightforward. All right. So with that, let's hop back into the lecture, and we have a lot more stuff to cover today. So, all right. So now let's talk about APIs and how we invoke them so that we can actually leverage them. So As a reminder, APIs are really just a URL with some sort of HTTP request, right? There are effectively millions of APIs that are available, and we're going to go over some, a list of which are available here, and you might notice that these are the same that I gave for the project, right? Now, to call and invoke an API, you can use a client like Postman or Insomnia, which will allow you to send and receive data from API. And here you'll also be able to see the JSON data. And this is the best way to test APIs and ensure they are working as expected and returning what you expect, right? Now, to test APIs, we're going to use this website, restfulapi.dev, which will provide us some sample APIs to test with. But before that, I want to dig a little bit into like what is the structure of an API, right? And of Insomnia. So in Insomnia, right, the first thing you'll see is there is a HTTP request type on the, I can't point that way, but this way on the HTTP request type, right? And that indicates if it's a post, get, something like that, right? So that's really important. Then there's the API URL, right? And so that'll be like this RESTful API dev, which we'll go into, has a few APIs. And then you can actually choose the type of data sent in the body, right? So there's a little button here. By default, I think it says none. You click it and you can choose JSON, XML, whatever. And then is the body, right? The body is actually what gets sent, right? And then you get a response from the API, right? The response will show up on the right-hand side, right? So all of this is how we actually test APIs and how we can leverage them in our code, right? So it's really important. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that I mentioned this earlier, but like, what if I go to Amazon? Obviously, if I'm logged in, not everyone in the world can see my orders, right? So APIs are stateless though. So how do they actually know that it's me? So APIs have authentication, right? So this is an optional element of an API to be able to authenticate against it, which basically allows the API to have a secure element and know who is accessing it and ensure it's not being abused or your data is not leaking, right? Imagine if everyone could see everyone's Amazon orders. That would be insane, right? So what we do in APIs is we use something called a token, a bearer token. And what happens is when you call the API, you call it with this bearer token and you say, hey, this is me. This is my information, right? So in the GitHub of the public APIs, you'll notice that there is a section called auth key, which indicates if an API requires an auth key. Now, this authentication will be passed in via the header, and it's via something called a bearer token. Now, we don't really need to understand the specifics of this, but it's really good to just understand what it is. Now, when we add authentication, right, it can vary based on the authentication method requested by the API. There is no real standard and can significantly vary based on the API you're using. So for your project, please read the documentation, right? And we'll go over an example, but it's very crucial because every single API has a slightly different way of doing it, right? And if you have any specific concerns, feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to help and take a look and see if we can figure out how we can authenticate, right? So a lot of people like use like TMDB, which is the movie database, right? There's like an API key you need to provide in the API so that it works, right? All of this is really important, right? So let's go ahead, hop on over to Insomnia and start like just exploring a little bit about how we can use this, right? So let's go to this RESTful API.dev first. So this is basically a testing website, which you can actually use and actually gives a bunch of nice, like kind of examples on how to use it, right? So you can see there's like, oh, different things. What is a REST API? All these kind of things, right? So it's really nice, right? So pretty cool, right? So for example, there's a list of all objects, right? Which it even tells you like there's a response, etc. Right? So let's go to Insomnia and actually test how this might work. So let's open up Insomnia. All right, so here we have Insomnia. Let's start taking a look at what we have. So what we're going to do is go ahead and create a new API here, right? Click new HTTP request. And like I said, okay, here's the get, right? Post, put, patch, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let's go to the RESTful API.dev. And what we're going to do is go ahead and click, copy this link, right? And go to Insomnia and paste it, okay? And just click send. And okay, here we go. Here's our request. Now, you might ask, okay, what's the point of all of this, right? And it's a really good question. Well, what's really important with Insomnia and all these tools is it allows us to test how our API is going to look before going and coding, right? Because if we don't know confident that, hey, this is what I expect to get when I test something, then I can't go and code, because in our code, we might notice errors, we might notice parsing issues, we might notice, hey, the API is failing for some reason, right? Maybe I'm calling it wrong. Maybe I'm sending in the wrong data, right? So if I can determine those things beforehand, it eliminates all those variables from the code itself, right? So it makes it a lot easier to debug, right? So like, for example, let's say instead I was doing a post to here, right? And then you got a 400. And in the code, you were also coding a post. Well, then you'd be like, huh, and you might bang your head against a wall for hours, right? But here you can just test and say, maybe if I do a get, or maybe there's something else, it'll work, right? So this is a very important tool in the stack for engineers, right? Being able to test before you start is very important, right? Especially when you're using external companies' APIs, right? So now let's test the add. So here's the add object. So here, what you can see, it's actually the same URL, right? But the type is different. So we'll copy this, right? And we'll go to Insomnia here, and we'll change this to a post. And now let's say we don't send in anything, right? What's going to happen? It's going to say, hey, you're not doing something right. So now let's say we add a JSON, right? And click send. Now we get a response, right? And it says, great, look at that. Now what's interesting here is you'll see here, you can actually see all the types of things you can send. There's this thing called EDN. Don't know what that is actually. I should ask Google. But anyway, but you can actually send all these kind of data, right? So it's really interesting what you can do, right? So now here we go. We created this data and it's created at X amount of time. Success, right? Pretty cool, right? So this is where Insomnia really shines, right? So now let's go ahead and start taking a look at a different type of API, which requires authentication, and how we might be able to leverage that, right? So let's go back here and go to our GitHub public APIs, right? Now here we're going to go, there's a bunch of APIs. We're going to go to the St. Louis, maybe if I type, or Louis. Yes, we're going to go to FRED, the economic data from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So now you'll notice here it says API key auth, right? Very important. So now let's go to FRED. And FRED basically has a very nice list of APIs where you can see all of these kind of things, right? So let's go ahead and see. Let's say we want to get, the get all releases of economic data. I don't know. So now let's go ahead and copy this, right? And if you see actually on their website, they have an XML option and a JSON option. Honestly, for us, we're going to use the XML or JSON option. So we're going to go there and we're going to do this and click get, okay? And we're going to make sure we have no body. No body. Perfect, and send it. Now you're going to see something. It's going to say, hey, you sent this API, blah, 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 and it didn't work, right? And so I say, hey, the value for variable API key is not registered, right? So if you see in the link a little closer, you'll notice there is a API key that it requires, right? And that is what actually says, hey, you're not abusing us, right? Or abusing our API, right? Because what a lot of people will do for DDoS reasons or whatever, they'll start going crazy on the API and they'll hit hundreds, thousands of times and overload an API. So most APIs that are public have limits. And to enforce these limits, often what they use is API keys. Or you can also use this API key to store preferences of a user, etc., right? But effectively, it's used as both authentication and a recognition system, but also like a rate limiter. So now let's say we want to go here. Let's say we want to log in, right? So I think I have an account. So API key, right? And you can create an API key. As you can see, I did this last year as well. API key to demo to students in INST377 SPR25. Okay. And we click request API key. Okay, now it says, okay, great, you have this API key. I'm going to copy it. Please don't use my API key and overload them, but I guess if you want to, please don't. But here we go. All right, so we're going to go back and go back to the website. And now all we're going to have to do is go here and click where it says key equals. and just replace it with the API key. And if we click send, now look at that, we got all the data, which is pretty cool, right? So an API key is a really important part, right? And there's also a different type of key called a bearer token, which is something like from this website, jot.io. This is what we use in work. But basically, these are like these very interesting like payloads, right? And these payloads basically, when decoded, contain data. So as you can see, they contain JSON data. For example, they have the name, they have the admin, they have the different things, right? So this can actually be very valuable. So it can store like different sets of data about the user, right? And what's really good about this is basically you don't have to store it anywhere. All of this can be used and done at request time, right? So it's really nice, right? So this is pretty cool. So a JWT is called a JOT, JSON Web Token, is very powerful and very common industry tool used in SaaS applications and such. So it's a very useful kind of like tool, right? And if you go to like your favorite websites, you might be able to find JOT tools, right? Or JOT and see what they store. So yeah, something interesting, right? All right. So now with that, let's head back to the slides and, do a little more interesting stuff. All right, so now we're going to talk about, honestly, probably the most exciting thing we're going to do. So what we're going to talk about is how we can actually get API calls made in our code, right? And in JavaScript, right, we can make this API calls and populate data live on our website, right? Which is amazing, super exciting, actually, right? So in JavaScript, the way to do this is with a function called fetch, right? Fetch is actually how you invoke API in code. So the fetch function is effectively just like making a Postman call, but in your code, or Insomnia call in your code. So fetch allows us to do a get, post, put, etc., and get the data and actually use it in our JavaScript code. Now this is amazing because what happens is this actually gives us access to the JSON returned by the API and allows us to create interactive data with what's being provided by the API, and also allows us to send JSON data as necessary for requests. So for an example, right? Let's say you want to get stock data and display it on a stock chart, right? You can now do that, right? Or you can say, hey, you're purchasing a product. Let me record this in my orders table. This is an amazing way to do it as well, right? So there's all these kind of amazing, cool things you can actually do. And you can actually just, I don't know, this is just like something amazing that you can do, right? Like, so now you can create all these interactive and like very dynamic experiences where like something gets saved somewhere, responded, etc., right? And that's what your project will be doing as well. So it's very, very exciting, right? So let's start with how we can do this. So here's an example of a fetch function, right? So a fetch function looks just like any other JavaScript function, but it's kind of interesting, right? So let's take a look and break down some of this. So first, in the fetch, you have the URL. So for example, here we're using the api.restfulapi.dev/objects, right? So we're making a call to that. And then, it's funny I say then, but then there is a .then clause, right? So what this is saying, this .then basically says, hey, take the response of this and then do something. So what's actually happening here? So it's saying, hey, .then, take the res, which stands for response, and convert it to a JSON. So why is it doing that, right? So what it's saying here is, remember, the response could be XML, it could be anything, right? So it's saying, hey, I know this is a JSON, so convert it to a JSON object, right? Then from there, another .then says, hey, now take that thing, that response.json, call it response, right? And then start operating on it, right? So now we're saying, hey, log res, and then for each response object, assume it's an array, right? Create an element called option and do something, right? And we'll talk about what we can do, but there's all these interesting things. Now, one thing that's really important to note is here you see I'm doing a res.forEach. Now that's highly dependent on if response is an array or an object. Since response is an array, I can do a .forEach. If response was an object, I could not do that. But since response is an array, I can. I can loop through it effectively, right? Now, let's say we want to change the type of HTTP request. So what we can do for that is we can actually add a method. So as you can see, what we did here is we took the fetch, and then after the URL, we added a comma. And then we added this like little JSON stuff, right? And this JSON stuff basically says method post, body, JSON.stringify, headers, content type, blah, 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 right? So you could add like API key, your JOT token here. You could add like a custom body, right? So imagine you want to actually send data. All of that can be added here, right? So we can actually add all these things, right? And then you do your .then statement, right? So to take the response of that and actually leverage it, right? So all of this actually allows us to build like a very cool like kind of experience where we can actually get data from external like APIs, right? So from other providers, and then use it. And by the end of this class, hopefully you could even become your own API provider, which, hey, sounds pretty cool to me, you know? I think I'd love to do that, so yeah. All right, so let's dive a little bit deeper. So here, the fetch method, after the comma, a JSON with options is inserted. You have the method, which is post, put, or get. Then the method, if it supports a body, remember gets do not support a body, you can put that, and then any headers, right? So that's important, right? Okay. And often there will be times where we need to deal with errors from our fetch, right? There can be errors from the API, there can be errors with what the user inputs and sends along, there can be errors with what you put, right? It can be multiple errors. So what we have to be able to do is to be able to catch these errors that occur in the fetch, and also be able to parse these errors based on the type of error being sent along. So what we can do is we can actually check the status code from the API before converting the output to JSON. The res object will actually have the status code available, and you can check it with res.status, right? So for example, let's take a look here, right? You can do console.log status res.status. If res.status does not equal to 200 and does not equal to 304, 304 means like cached, then throw a new error, right? That's an interesting option. And if you recall, 200 means good, okay, right? So if it's neither of these, then throw an error, else do res.json, right? So this is how we can actually do error handling, right? And once you check the status code and determine that there is some sort of error, right, you can actually throw an exception. This exception will then be caught, and then you can create a catch clause to account for this. And catch will catch any error thrown from the API and deal with it. And you can define how to deal with it. It can be something simple like maybe logging, or you could even do some fancy stuff and maybe show an error box, right? Okay, so this is a lot of information, and it's really hard to process this without going to an example. So let's hop right into VS Code and actually try this and see what we can do. All right, so let's go ahead and hop into our favorite app, VS Code, and let's get started. So here, let's go ahead and create a new file in week 8. Let's create a new file here. We'll call it INST377-week8-populate form lecture.html. Okay, and I'm going to copy that name and then create a JavaScript file with the exact same name. So we'll copy that, but do a .js. Okay, perfect, right? All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to close off the other files because we don't need them. Okay, cool. All right, so what are we going to do? So let's say, what if we could do something where we say, hey, we have this API, maybe this API is giving us all this object data, right? Let's say we could show all the objects, right, that are available for a user. And then let's say they could add the objects as well, right? Or they could add new objects, right? Wouldn't that be super, super cool, right? That would be something really interesting that can be done, right? So that's exactly what we're going to do. So how are we going to leverage this data, show it on a table, and then also be able to add objects, right? That'll be a really interesting way to do things, right? So first, let's think about, first, let's build out the basic HTML, right? So let's call it HTML. And then let's create a title here, a head title. Let's call it populate form. And then do script and do defer, right? And do source equals JavaScript / populate form. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to think about, okay, so what we can do is get these objects, right? And maybe what we can do is make a drop down so that someone can go and select the object and get its data, right? Wouldn't that be kind of cool, right? So how do we actually do that? That's a really interesting question, right? Because there's a lot of ways you could do something similar, right? Maybe you could do something like, oh, get the data, show on a display, on a drop down, those kind of things, right? So first, let's start setting up a form, right? So let's do a one. Let's call this form options. And here, let's go ahead and create a form. And what we'll do here is we will have a, let's just create a form, nothing else, a very simple form. And what it'll do is it'll ask for a person's name, right? Equals name. And do name, name colon, right? And then input type equals text, right? And name equals name, right? And then put a BR, and then we'll do a label for equals product ID. Okay, and we'll see where I'm going with this, right? I have a vision, right? I have a vision, okay? And what we'll do is we'll create a select, right? And that select will have the ID equal to product ID, right? And the name equal to product ID as well, okay? Now, please hold for my vision, right? And now we'll do an input type equals submit. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and now let's close, let's go to our server and see how it looks, okay? So we're going to go, all right, looks interesting. Now, let's start thinking about what we can do, right? So imagine, right? Again, I don't know why it's using this one. Sorry. Let me close this browser. So let's go to our browser here, right? Now imagine what we can do is we can say, hey, take the ID from here and the name of this object and show it in the dropdown and show all of these, right? Wouldn't that be really, really cool? Right? So let's do exactly that, right? So what we'll do is go back to here, and what we'll do is we'll go to our JS file, right? And in our JS file, let's go ahead and create a function called populate form, right? And let's make sure that this function is called every time we start up the app, right? Because obviously that form needs to be there as soon as we load. Okay, perfect. All right, so now what are we going to do here, right? So let's think about this. So first thing we're going to do is actually, right, we're going to need to get these objects somehow, right? So how are we going to do that? So what we can do is we can do a fetch, right? And this fetch can actually include that API, right? So let's go ahead and copy this URL, right? And go back here, right? Perfect, right? So now, perfect, we have this. Now let's go ahead and take this a step further. So now what we can do is do a dot then, right? And if you remember, right, we take the result, right? And then convert it to a result.json, right? So this puts the data into a JSON format. And then we do another dot then, and then take that result JSON, and then we can do whatever we want with it. So let's go ahead and say we're going to do a console.log result JSON. Okay, let's see what happens, right? This is all we need. Let's take a look. Let's make sure that, oh, I forgot to close off this. All right, perfect. Looks a lot better now. Actually, did I do something? Am I done something? Ah, I forgot to add parentheses here. My bad. And then you can close this actually. Okay, cool. Sorry, I messed up the parentheses. You need parentheses here. Okay, cool. So now let's go ahead and let's go to this page, right? And go to, let's go to localhost. I have lost the link, so let's go back and restart my API here. Browser is messed up. Okay, so let's go to inspect and let's take a look at what we see. So console. All right, look at that. This is really interesting. So now what we're seeing is we're getting an array back, right? An array is a list of objects. So if we look here, look at that. We see an array, right? Now what's really interesting is, okay, great. We see this array, right? So what do we do? Well, now what that means is we can iterate through this array, right? How do we iterate through an array? Well, what we can do is we can do something like this. So we can do result JSON.for each. So actually, let's add a comment. Result JSON is an array, right? So we can for each it. Okay. Now, so what we can do is we can type result JSON.for each, right? And delete this. I don't know how it automatically created that. So for each, and then for each, we can call it result object, right? And what we can do is we can do console.log and do object colon $ result object. Okay, cool. Now let's go see what this happens now. So now you can see here, right? We actually see every single object 13 times, but that doesn't actually look right because we can't tell what it is. So what if we did a JSON.stringify, right? So that we could see what's actually being printed, right? So we can see this. Look at that. So now you can see every single object. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Now this is really interesting. So now what we can do is now we can actually start leveraging this and seeing what kind of unique variations we can do. So what do we want to do? Well, remember, we want to create a dropdown that shows each of the names of these objects. So how do we do that? Well, so this uses something called JSON, like how, if you remember, throwback to the DOM manipulation that we can do. So what we can do is above the fetch, right? Let's do a const called product select, and that will be equal to document.getElementById, and what you'll do is product ID, right? So what is this, right? So product ID, if you recall, is the select, right? So maybe you can see where I'm going with this, right? So now we can use that and actually start creating select elements, right? So let's go back to how we create a select in HTML. Okay. So if you look at the Gemini answer here, right, you actually create options. So what you can do is you can use a document create element, right? And what that allows you to do is create any type of element. So imagine we can create an option element, right? And we can actually append that option element live into the HTML. Now you can start seeing the power of what we can do, right? So how do we do this? So this is really cool, right? This is where it gets really interesting, right? So now we can do a populate select form with options, okay, with the results, okay. So what we can do is we can do const option, right, and we can do equal to document.create element, and we can say we want to create a option element, right? And now we have this option element. So now what we can do is we can do option dot value equal to result object dot, right, or at, right, ID, right? So remember, that basically gets us the ID. Oh, sorry, wrong one. That gets us the ID here, right? The ID, right? And then we also want the name, right? So what we can do is option dot inner HTML equal to result object at name. Now, you might look at this and be like, whoa, that's pretty cool, right? But still not showing up, right? So now let's take a look, right? So now here's a great way to debug, right? So now let's go look at the elements. So now we see all these elements, right? And you can see exactly what's happening. But the problem is, you know, like you see all these great, but, you know, I don't see anything, right? So what that means is, though we have created the element, it's actually not being appended or attached anywhere. So what we do now is we take product select dot append child, which basically adds a child element to the select, right? And you append option, right? So now you can see, look at that. And now if you look at your elements, you'll also see everything is there. Now, isn't that so cool? So now from an API, you have live values being populated, right? So you can see all the values here, and this is amazing, right? This is unbelievable. Now, this is not the end of it, right? So now let's take this a step further. So if you remember from last class, we had a nice API that I created that allows us, and I've mostly set this up. So what we can do is we can go to the form and make it a method equals get, right? And add an action to it. And that action can be the URL that we used last class, which I'm going to paste here. It should be available for you if you need it. And now imagine this, right? So first of all, add a BR here. Totally forgot about this. Now imagine this. So now we have this cool thing. And now I type in mol. And now I can go and I see all of these. I click submit and look at that. Isn't that unbelievable? Isn't that so cool, right? This is a unbelievable experience that you can now build, right? So now you can take this and be like, wow, look at this. I built this cool thing, right? It's great, right? Now, what you can do is now take this even further, right? So now we've built this, but now let's say we want to add objects, right? How could we do that, right? So let's say we want to add objects somewhere, right? And maybe let's go to the REST API here. Let's go to RESTful API.dev, right? Let's say we want to add object, right? So we need to pass in all this data, right? So how do we do that, right? So let's go ahead and build that out too. So now let's add a new HR, right? A horizontal rule. Okay. And what we can do here is now we'll do a form, right? And for now we'll do this, and we will add a few labels. So we'll add a label for equals product name, right? And do a name colon, right? And then do a input type equals text, right? Name equals, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Name equals name, right? And ID equals product name. Okay, now where am I making these up, right? Where's this name coming from? Where's this product name, right? So if you remember here, we have to use these as the names. So name, data, etc., right? So these are really important, right? But we'll come up with why this doesn't matter that much when it comes to submissions, but you'll see. Okay, so just remember these IDs are really important for us, okay? So now let's go ahead and add a BR and then do the same for label for equals product price and do price colon, right? And then do input type equals number, right? Price is usually a number. And then name equals price. And then ID equals product price. Okay. Okay, cool. And then add another BR and then add the last element, which is the year, right? Just for now, we'll come back to if this matters or not. But, product year and then do year colon and then do equals text, or actually should probably be a number as well. Number, sorry, I forgot quotes around that. And then do name equals year, and then ID equals product. Perfect. Amazing. And then add a BR, and then do an input type equals submit. Okay, nice. Oh, forgot something. Okay, cool. Look at that. Okay, now this is really interesting. So now what we can do is take this an interesting step further. So now let's go back to our JS, right? Now, in our JS, we need to create a new function to actually support this, right? So what we can do is we can do a function add object, right? Function add object, right? Now, one thing to note. this object, obviously, you need to call this at some point, right? So what we can do is we can go to our form, and what we can do is we can do a onSubmit. OnSubmit equals add object. Okay. And now, remember, if you remember the last class, we talked about, or one of the previous classes, we talked about how after all of this, you need to return false, otherwise it'll immediately go to another page, right? So make sure here we return false, right? Otherwise this will go and do some funky stuff, which we can experiment with a little bit, but yeah. All right, so now what are we going to do? So first things first, right? First, we'll add a log here, call it attempting to add object, right? Always good to log your code, right? So you know where you are in your code, so you can debug. Attempting to add object, right? Now, let's go ahead and think about this a little bit. So what do we want to do? So first thing we want to do is actually add via the API RESTful dev API objects, right? That's what we want to do. Right? So how do we do that? So first we can add a fetch, right? And this fetch can go to that URL, right? So let's go ahead and go there, and it's going to be API RESTful API.dev/objects. Great. But now we need to take this a step further. So we need to create a options, or like a options like kind of thing, right? So what we can do is we can do this. So we can create a const fetch options, right? Equal to, and in curly braces, what we can do is we can have a method colon post, right? Method colon post. And then what we can do is we can actually add headers, right? Now, you might ask, okay, what are these for? You know, I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, at where we are in the application, just trust me. It's like that meme, trust me, bro. That's kind of what you're going to have to do. Just trust me, bro, and add these, right? So we can just add those, application/JSON here, right? And then we can add the body, right? Which is really important, right? Because the body is actually what actually gets added to the object, right? So the body, right? Now, let's come back to this, right? And I'll explain why, right? So now what we can do is you can pass this fetch options as a comma fetch options, right? You could also directly write it, but I think this just makes it a little cleaner, right? So this is interesting. Okay, so now let's think about this a little bit, right? So what we want to do is we want to take the body, right? And in the body, we need to pass in a few things. We need to pass in the name, right? Then we need to pass in certain data, right? And the data here is optional, but we'll pass in these two, right? So how do we actually do that, right? It's a great question. So what we can do is we can type here, and we can type name colon product name, right? Or, well, actually that's a lie. So if we take the name, right, we have to do document.getElementById product name, right? Dot value, right? That value is really important, right? Don't forget about that, right? Because otherwise it won't give you the right data, right? So that's one thing, right? Then we can do a data, and then colon, and then curly braces again because it's a JSON, and then do year colon document.getElementById product year dot value, and then price will be document.getElementById product price dot value. Perfect. Okay. So this is one of the ways we could do it, right? So what this is saying is, hey, this fetch options contains a method post, has a header of this, and the body will be these values, right? Now you might think, oh, okay, that's great. I mean, that seems easy enough, should work. Like, I don't see any issues, right? Now, let's go ahead and see what happens. So what we can do is just go back to our form, and let's just go to our console, clear this out, and type in some data. So unmol 125 and year 2025. Name actually is the product name, so iPhone 56. Sure. So now let's click submit. Now it says attempting to add object, and then we got a 400, right? You can see that, right? Now let's go to the network tab and see what happened. So if you see here, there's actually an objects call. Now what's interesting is the request payload just says object, right? So what's the request payload? The request payload is what is being sent to the server. And if object is being sent, nothing could be parsed, right? So that's really interesting, right? And the reason that happens is because JavaScript is not that smart, right? Sometimes it just doesn't understand that, hey, I want to send this as string, right? So what you have to do is you have to do JSON.stringify and put all of these in parentheses, right? So you have to put this whole thing in a parenthesis, okay? Now let's try this, right? So let's do the same thing. Price 125 and 202.354, whatever. Now look at this. So now what's interesting is look at the console, right? It says the type error, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't really matter what it's saying. So now if you look at the network tab, right, there should be, actually, hold on. Let me see something. Okay, interesting. So we are getting an issue. Type error, failed to execute fetch on window. The provided value is not of type request in it. Okay. All right. Let's see. All right. So I think the issue we're having is we have to have a dot then. So let's add a dot then really quickly. And this is going to be the exact same dot then as we had above. What is this? Okay. The formatting's a little weird, but I'll take it for now. Alright, sorry, I'm back, and I made a really dumb mistake. Okay. I meant to put the JSON.stringify here, okay? Because the body has to be JSON.stringify, not the whole thing. That is my bad. Super dumb mistake. Okay, let's try this again. So, price 2024, I don't know. Okay, now look at this. Attempting to add object. Now, if we go to the network tab, we'll see this objects actually got added, which is so cool, right? And we can see the preview, and there you go. Created it. Isn't that pretty cool? I'd like to think it is, at least. So now that's pretty interesting, right? So now what we can do is we can actually take this data and then actually process it. So we can add the dot then result, add the result.json, and then dot then we can do a result JSON, and then do a console.log response colon $sign response or result JSON. All right, cool. All right, so okay, great, and let's do 2035. All right, now let's go ahead and see what happens. All right, console. All right, look at that. Now we're getting a response, right? Isn't that super cool? We're starting to see some stuff happen, right? Ideally, we should JSON.stringify this, right? So we can actually see the data because it's obviously an object coming in. Okay, let's do that again. All right, look at that. That is so cool. All right. So now you can see how you can actually leverage this data and you can actually get some really, really interesting results, right? Because now you could actually create forms, you can populate that data somewhere, you can do all these really, really interesting things, right? Imagine you could even take that response and then show it on the table, right? You could do all these really super cool things, right? All right, so now let's hop on back to the lecture as there are a few more things we have to cover, right? Feels like a long lecture, it is, but there's a lot of really important things that we want to talk about, okay? All right, so now the next thing I want to talk about is session storage, right? So now when we create these APIs, right? Or, you know, this isn't super API. Well, okay, so when we create APIs, right, often we want to take the data and then save it so that we can use it later. So let's say for some reason we want to save JSON in the browser to be used later. For example, we need to store the information from one API call to be used later. This is what we call session storage, and this is cleared when you close the browser, right? So basically it goes in your session, sets an item, right? And then you can basically log that data or use it in the rest of your app. And you can go and you can retrieve the sessions by using the key, right? So there's a session storage key, right? There, on the other hand, is also local storage. Now, if you need something that lasts longer than session storage, there is something called local storage. Local storage doesn't expire, right? And this is very commonly used, right? For example, we use a platform called Snowflake, and when you log on to Snowflake, every single time, right, we have this E2E test that's run. So this is like an automated testing suite that runs, and basically our testing suite breaks every single time because it basically stores certain preferences based on your browser, right, in local storage. But the problem is every time a test suite runs, it resets that storage, right? So it actually doesn't lose it. So sometimes we'll get new pop-ups and things that, you know, on a normal user, we would have dismissed and it would have stored that. But since they don't store it, like since they store it in the browser and the end-to-end test runs and resets it, it basically always pops up and messes up our test, right? So local storage is very common, right? So for example, you might store user preferences, like for example, dark mode, right? That's a very common user preference, right? Or you might cache certain data, right? Or you might store form data even, right? And it's very easy to do. So all you do is you type this local storage.set item and you just store it, right? So, you know, this is kind of cool, right? So I want to show you a real use case of this and how you might use it, right? Dark mode is a very good example, right? So let's go ahead and take a look, right? All right, so let's go back to VS Code. And what we'll do is we'll, again, create a new file. We'll call it storage data, okay? So let's create this, and we'll call it a new file. We'll do INST377-week8 storage data lecture.html, right? And I'm going to copy this so that I can also create a JS file for it. So I'm going to create a JavaScript file in the exact same name. Okay, cool. So let's go here. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and create a new HTML, right? And we'll call it, add a head here, add a title, call it storage data. And we will add a script here, defer, and do source equals, where is it? JavaScript slash INST storage data lecture.js. Okay, perfect. All right, cool. All right, so now let's go ahead and we'll type body here, right? And here what we'll do is we'll add a h1 and do storage data example. Okay. All right. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, you know, we're going to create dark mode for users, right? Let's do that, right? That'll be actually really fun and a real practical use case of storage data, right? So let's go ahead and figure out how to do this. So, well, we can do this two ways. Well, we can do session storage or local storage. For the purpose of this, we're going to use local storage just because it's a lot easier to kind of like use it, right? So how are we going to do that? So first of all, we need to set something in local storage, and then also we need to toggle like the background color, right? That's two things. So how do we do that? So that's a really great question. So first, let's go ahead and create a function called set background color, right? Set background color. Okay. And what's going to be in this function? So this function is going to be very simple. So first we're going to say, hey, if, right, local storage dot get item, and we'll call it dark mode, right, is equal to disabled, right? And we can do anything, but I'm going to use disabled, or local storage dot get item dark mode equals null, right? Then that means document dot body dot style dot background color equals white. And, or white. And, oh my gosh, what's going on? White. And document.body.style.color, right, which is the text color, is equal to black. Right? Perfect. Else, right, it's basically the exact opposite, right? So, okay, go here, set this up. Perfect. Let's do black, and let's do white. Okay, so first of all, right, this is basically a very simple function, right? What is this saying? So it's saying, hey, there's this local storage, right? If there's something in there called dark mode and it's called disabled, then set the color to white. Or if it's null, set it to white. Else, that means dark mode is enabled, right? So then set it to black, right? So what we're going to do is call window.onload equal to set background color. So that is called every single time that the browser starts up, which is very important, obviously, right? So how are we going to do this? So let's go back, right, and go to our HTML here, right? And what we can do in our HTML is we're going to create a button, right? So we'll create a button. And what we'll do is on click, we will toggle dark mode, right? Now, obviously, we haven't created this function yet, but we will, right? And here we'll do a toggle dark mode. Okay, great, cool, nice and easy, right? Now, let's go ahead and first launch this page and just make sure it's all working, okay? So here we go, right, great. And, you know, this doesn't do anything yet, but okay, looks fine. Okay, so now how do we actually toggle this dark mode, right? So now let's go back to our data lecture, right? And think about this. So first, let's go ahead and create that function, right? Function toggle dark mode, right? So now how do we do this? So how do we even look at local storage, right? So first of all, let's go back to our browser here. Now, when you right click and you click inspect, right, you'll see here there's a bunch of options, and here there's a little arrow. So click that arrow and you'll see there's this thing called application, right? And in here you'll see a local storage option. So here you can see all the variables that are saved, right, anytime you go to anywhere, right? Which is really interesting, right? So now let's go ahead and actually store something in local storage, right? That's really important for us, right? So how do we do that? So let's go ahead and say if local storage dot get item dark mode, right, equals null, or local storage dot get item dark mode equals disabled, right? Then local storage dot set item dark mode, comma, enabled. Okay, right? So what this is saying is, hey, oh, I forgot to put a parenthesis here, didn't I? Wait, sorry. I've got a parenthesis somewhere. Okay, much better. Okay, so what we're saying is if the dark mode is disabled or doesn't exist, then dark mode should go to enabled. Else, right, set it to disabled, right? Because that means it's already enabled, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. So let's go back, go here, go to the browser, and let's toggle dark mode, right? Now look at that. That's pretty cool, right? So now dark mode is enabled, right? Now let's toggle it again. Disabled. But you might be like, hey, it's not actually doing anything. But that's okay. Let's set it to enable and then refresh the page. Be like, whoa, it worked. Isn't that pretty cool? So now let's say I quit the browser, right? I close the browser and open up the browser again, right? And then go back. it's still there, which is super cool, right? That means it's still preserved in our memory, right? Which is really interesting and really cool to actually see, right? So now what we can do is we can go back, and now let's go ahead and um, work on, okay, if I toggle it to disabled, it should go to white mode, right? Or light mode, right? So what we can do now is here at the end of all of this, just do set background color. Okay. And now we can go back here, or no, go back to here, and now toggle, 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 and look at that. I've made a light show apparently. All right. Now, this is super cool, right? Because this is actually really fundamental, right? A lot of people don't realize this, but this is basic web dev. This is a lot of web dev, right? So it's kind of cool to see that, wow, like this is super easy and like I can actually do this, right? If you go to any website, you'll actually see that this local storage has a bunch of stuff, right? Even if you go to like Canvas, you go anywhere, you'll probably see there's a bunch of local storage, right? Because Canvas even has a dark mode. It's likely that they store it on something like this. So it's very useful and very actually like useful. All right. So we have one more thing to go through today, which is mocking. Now, what is mocking? So, why are you mocking me? No, I'm kidding. So, sometimes we expect data from an API, but for some reason the server is down, we max out the API, something else, right? If that's the case, are we out of luck? No. So, mocking can actually help solve that problem. Now, I'll tell you a very real world use case for this. So in our project, we're actually doing a lot of investment now and kind of like improving the developer experience. And one of the problems we have is we have all these legacy servers, but they're down half the time. So development gets stuck because we rely on the real hosted versions of those services. So what we're trying to do is actually mock those responses. So then locally, we can just like test our code without relying on the web server being active, right? So mocking can help with that a lot, right? So mocking is very valuable. Mocking effectively means we emulate the output of an API, right? So for example, normally you go from the computer to the server, right? Mocking takes all of this out and says, hey, I'm just going to host the response on your machine. And I'm going to pretend like you're hitting the API, but really not, right? So that's really useful, right? So it's basically like the machine going back to itself, right? Now, mocking is extremely valuable, right? I can tell you for a fact, this class specifically has maxed out the APIs of multiple like websites because of just how many students are doing work. We have quite literally, I've had students mock out, like get UMD servers blacklisted, but you know, we've got them restored, but without that, right, we have actually maxed out APIs, and mocking is the only way to solve our problem, because otherwise, like often the way development works, like your browser will refresh very often, so you'll hit the API so many times that it'll actually max out the limit of the API, right? So mocking helps us eliminate that and allow us to test on the actual like emulated version of that code. So for this class, we're going to be using a tool called Mockhoon. Mockhoon allows us to easily make mock endpoints for use in our code. And it's completely free, right? So you can create mock APIs, super simple, really easy. I think it's open source as well. Let's see. Yeah, it has 7,000 stars on GitHub, so clearly it's free. Or clearly it's good, and it's open source. So really great. Yeah, so mocking makes it so that, you know, we have all this REST API, right? But let's say maybe I'm testing and I max out the API, right? I've done it multiple times, right? For example, let's go ahead and take a look. Let's see if I can easily max out an API here. So let's go back here. Let's see, I should have my RESTful API. Let's go here. And just hit this API quite a few times. I should be able to like max out this API very easily, actually. So I'm going to hit it. Okay, maybe it's much harder to mock out than I expected. Okay, cool. So I'm not able to mock this out very easily. Oh, here we go. Cool. I've hit the API limit. So now you're like, hey, I maxed out the API. What do I do, right? So, well, this is a very tragic problem, and it does happen once in a while, especially during development. So now you're like, hey, well, I can't hit this API anymore. What do I do, right? Like, I'm stuck, right? So now what we can do is we can use this thing called Mockhoon. So Makun is this really great product, which allows us to basically say, hey, instead of hitting the real API, what if you just hit this local API to test? So all you do in Makun is you open up this app, right? And all you do is you set the type of request, so a GET, and you set the URL, right? And you set the response. So we can set a response here. And you can actually do really interesting things. For example, you can add latency to your calls. So for example, you can go to here, and you can actually add that it takes 2000 milliseconds or something, right? You can add very interesting things. So I'm going to put 0, but that's interesting, right? And then all you do is you click play, right? Now this server has started. So you'll see there's a localhost :3000, right? So if you hit localhost :3000 / objects, your mock will hit, right? So let's try that. So let's go to Insomnia, and now let's go to http:// it is not s, and do localhost :3000. Look at that. Isn't that so cool? So now our API is alive, right? So now we can continue testing without relying on like the external server being active. So how do we do this in code, right? So let's go back to our JSON accent lecture.js, right? Or no, sorry, populate form lecture.js, right? So let's go ahead, and I'm going to open up this code again, right? Sorry. Go live. Nice. And we'll go here, go to network, and you'll see that we probably hit some API limit. Yep, see, 405, method not allowed, because we hit our, we've been rate limited effectively. So what we can do now, and you can see the dropdown is not populating. So what we can do now is go back to VS Code, and we'll go to the JS here. And what we'll do is something a little unique. So what we'll do is we'll say, hey, we're going to create a variable called const using mocked, right? And set that equal to true, right? Okay. And then what we'll do is we'll do const host name equal to using mocked question mark, right? And then do http:// localhost :3000 or api.restful-api.dev, right? Now you might ask, okay, what does this mean, right? So what this is saying, hey, if using mocked is true, right, then use localhost 3000. Else, use this real API. So now all we have to do is use this host name, change this to backticks, and set this up $sign here. Okay, now let's go see what happens. So let's go back, and oh, sorry, wrong browser. And look at that. That is so cool, right? So now, even though we're not hitting the real API, which you can see, localhost 3000, we're able to actually test our code without any risk, right? So now we're able to hit it a bajillion times, right? I can hit this 10 million times and nothing happens, right? I am testing this unbelievably amount of times, and I will not max out this API because it's my own. I'm not going to max out myself, right? So that's what's really cool about mocking out APIs. And this will allow you to test better. So I always recommend setting up a mock server with like your code or with like an example API response, because what I've noticed is in this class, because of the way we use live server and all those things, the pages refresh very often. So we get these mock, we hit API limits very, very often. So I really recommend setting it up. All right. So with that, that is all I had. I know this is a really long lecture, right? But thank you all for sticking around. We learned a lot of really exciting things today, and I guarantee these will all be very, very useful, even in the real world. All right. So with that, that's all I have, and I will see you all next week.